Hello, I'm Reverend Alexa Fraser, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm so happy to be here in this worship service with you. Today, we'll be talking about a type of journey, not the Odyssey or Divine Comedy or Gilgamesh, or even the trip that I took last summer. Now, this is a journey through time and place that many of us don't know much about. But like many expeditions, it is a journey that changes us all. So let us orient ourselves to the journey with a reading by Reverend Gretchen Haley. This reading is called Step Zero, and it begins, if you had the chance to start again, to make your life from scratch, to decide what sort of person you would be, who you would love and how, the content of your days, your hours, what songs would you sing to yourself or with others? What prayers would you let fall from your lips urgently and with praise, with mercy or hope? What blessings would you name and share with strangers and friends? If you could take now that first step, what journey would you begin? I am the interim minister at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Poughkeepsie. That congregation is small, and like most UU congregations, is primarily white, primarily elderly, and deeply interested in social justice issues, while struggling a bit about what that means. I can hear many of the people I've talked with there saying, what does this eighth principle mean? And what does it ask us to do? I'm not going to read you all of the principles again, just the first and the eighth. So principle one, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I know plenty of people who think that that does it once and done. With the first principle, we've got our covenantal agreement. If we all really behaved like each person was worthy, we'd be there. Beloved community. And yes, our world and our denomination is strengthened when the loving statement that affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person is proclaimed. But no, that isn't the whole agreement, promise, covenant we want our congregations to make to our association and amongst themselves. So now for the part of our journey today that explores the backstory. Unitarian Universalism has had a long and spotty history with regard to being a broadly welcoming multiracial denomination. We don't have time to go into the long and often very painful history here, but let me touch on a few points. Through the 1960s, and in many cases after that, Black applicants for Unitarian or Universalist or UU ministry were discouraged or even refused admission to our seminaries and ministerial fellowship. Remember, this is a historic problem going way back. Similar rejections happened when congregants or ministers tried to open churches or fellowships in predominantly Black neighborhoods. In the civil rights time, our denominational leadership didn't fulfill an important promise to our Black leaders. And indeed, that controversy, which is worthy of its own sermon, led to a racial rupture in our denomination. That rupture is being healed, but it is well known to many and continues to lead to utterly appropriate wariness from many of our leaders of color about the leadership in our denomination. Throughout our history, people from the global South have been told explicitly or implicitly that the church down the street, the one down the way, is for people like you. Many members and congregations pushed people of color away from attendance, membership, and leadership in our denomination. Yes, many UUs worked hard during the civil rights era, and yes, there is a proud and important history there, but we neglected to look at our own congregational and denominational behaviors towards people of color who applied for jobs or in other ways wanted to be and would have been great leaders. Black Lives of UU, or Blue as it is often called, was created by Black UUs, mostly queer Black women UUs, in 2015 to expand the power and capacity of Black UUs within our faith, provide support, information, and resources for Black UUs, and promote justice making and liberation through our faith. All of that led to the 2017 Blue-led teach-ins in many of our congregations. These were teach-ins about racism and white supremacy culture. One of the core messages of the teach-ins was that white supremacy, as a set of institutional assumptions and practices, often operates unconsciously and tends to benefit white people and exclude people of color. Actual white supremacists are not required in order to uphold white supremacist culture. Building a faith full of people who understand that key distinction between white supremacy culture and white supremacists is that essential as we work towards a more just society and denomination. Another core message of the teach-ins was that we need to focus on racism and white supremacy culture that sometimes often permeates our UU lives and work. So that gets us to Paula Cole-Jones, who has been one of the faces of the Eighth Principle movement within our denomination. What drove Paula, a UU poet, lay leader, consultant, and staffer at the UUA, to craft the Eighth Principle? She said that after working with congregations on these issues for over 15 years, she realized that a person can believe that they're being a good UU and following the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at the systemic level. So she and others wrote and proposed the 8th principle as an addition to our other principles in the bylaws of our denomination, and frankly, in our hearts. That was a lot of history. It represents a lot of pain, primarily for our Black and Brown members, and struggle and learning for many of us. I'll also name that many of us felt pain over the realization of how we have implicitly or explicitly treated people of color in less than loving ways. Personally, I've been changed by the events that led to the teach-ins and my study of the 8th principle. And so here we are at the 8th principle again. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. A journey towards spiritual wholeness and beloved community. But how do you do that? Paula Cole-Jones says, every time we challenge the structures that perpetuate injustice, we are saved. End quote. All are saved when we change the structures that perpetuate injustice. All are saved when we restore humanity to the world. This new principle fills a gap where our aspirations stated in the first 7 principles and the reality of what we do. Action words, journey, accountability, build, working, and more. Our spiritual awakening occurs by filling that gap with love. That sounds like a glorious journey to me. So let's go back to my congregation. After a year of study last May, my congregation voted on the 8th principle at their annual meeting. It was almost unanimous except for one abstention. I spoke with the abstainer afterwards, and she told me that the problem was she didn't know what to do to implement the 8th principle, and she didn't want to pass it without knowing what to do. Her abstention was actually a statement of love, an attempt to seek clarity, but I think her concerns are now well on their way to being addressed in that fellowship. So what's my congregation been doing to implement the 8th principle? I wanted to start by saying that they are listening more and talking, leading in the larger community, a bit less. Not listening to me, but seeking out people with firsthand experience of disenfranchisement so that the congregation can follow that person's lead. That's a big change. I wonder if you'll be able to see each example, in each example I'm about to give, something about that listening. Each committee, including the board, has had deep conversations figuring out what they could do within the charter of their committee and its work to move implementation forward. And each committee has developed a different approach to implementation. The committee that is planning the 70th anniversary celebration undertook to find a caterer that was minority owned, and that they have had a blast eating at restaurants and trying food that they might not otherwise have tried, looking for that caterer. A small thing. The Leadership Development Committee, what many congregations call a nominating committee, has worked hard to get past thinking that pushing our few Black members towards leadership is the best way to promote the 8th principle. Instead, they are focusing on widening the circle to understand how people with many identities, differently abled, elderly, young people, people with different class backgrounds, different lengths of membership in the fellowship, and more, can all engage with leadership and how all represent widening the circle within the fellowship. The membership committee took a course offered by the UUA on multicultural welcome. Parts of that were challenging in to some of our white members, but conversations continue and they've grown more comfortable with race-based affinity spaces, sometimes called caucus spaces. That's good learning. Our board led what they called the Big Read, a fellowship-wide book reading and conversation about the book, So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Olo. In a congregation with 70 members, they had 2 groups of 10 people each reading the book and discussing it over 4 sessions. That book is great. It has chapters like, what if I talk about race wrong? Why am I always being told to check my privilege? What is intersectionality and why do I need it? Is police brutality really about race? And what is cultural appropriation? The conversations, each led by a multiracial pair of leaders, were really thoughtful and have led to follow-on conversations about cultural appropriations in worship service and what priorities the Social Justice Committee should focus on. The board is also looking into revising the bylaws away from Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules is a very formalized way of running a meeting, and those new to leadership may miss some key element and be disenfranchised as a result. And of course, the 8th principle seems easiest to implement in a social justice context. But even that group has had some changes in the way that it is focusing its work. That committee has always been strong, but after some conversation amongst themselves, I'd say that they are more committed than ever to addressing racism locally. For instance, one of the nearby counties has had a series of racial bullying incidents targeted at mixed race kids. Those kids put out a video explaining their situation. Our Social Justice Committee has started attending open meetings and supporting members who are parents in that county when they get involved. Who thought babysitting a child whose parents were attending a PTA meeting focused on racial bullying would be an example of 8th principle implementation? That Social Justice Committee did. And now let's talk about what other congregations and what other social justice committees are doing. My home congregation in Silver Spring, Maryland, has adopted an Afghan family for 6 months. They're helping the family with what they say they need, renting a place and furnishing it, getting the kids enrolled in school and to a doctor. They're following the instructions of the family and providing what the church can. After the family graduates, my home church is going to join the local Industrial Areas Foundation. That work, again, involves deep listening to the needs of local poor people about what systemic changes are needed to improve their lives. Affordable housing or after-school programs for all kids of all ages. We don't know what will emerge. We do know that we will listen. I personally work with the project to commemorate the lynching victims in my county. 3 men were lynched in my county in the 1800s, and some of us organized commemorations and educational campaigns about that locally. Did you know that there was a man lynched in your county, here in Pinellas County? The group Pinellas Remembers commemorates that death and has installed a marker commemorating that victim. Mr. John Evans on the corner of Old 9th Street, which I understand is now Martin Luther King Jr. Street, and 2nd Avenue South. I've spoken with one of the leaders of that group, and I know that they would be interested in connecting. And I'm sure all of you would learn by listening to them. Let's chat if you want that name and phone number. And you know what? My home congregation, the congregation I serve in Poughkeepsie, none of them are going to get it right all the time. They're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. All of us make mistakes, but they are trying and they will start over in love, apologize, figure out how to do better, and resume being brave and working for change. Ultimately, this is all quite personal. As I said to my congregation, this is about how the 8th principle changed us, each individually and as a group. The critical part of implementing this principle for all of us is figuring out what it really asks of us. To me, the real ask embedded in a study of and vote for this principle is the determination that it will be central to all the work we do. It means we're making a commitment for not just social justice, but membership, worship, all of the committees, all of the people to focus on anti-racism work. Everyone will be wondering and imagining how to be anew. The eighth principle is not a social justice project, but potentially central to who we are becoming. How will study of this principle, and I hope its acceptance in this fellowship, change you as a group and as individuals? For me, I can say that I believe, as psychologist and author Joan Boyarensko says, some tension is needed for the soul to grow. I've put the tension of building this covenant and affirming to promote the principle to good use. I am changed as a result of my study, and I hope the same for you. Let me loop back to the reading with which we started today's journey. Gretchen Haley's reading ends. What work would you take? What mischief would you make with boldness and bravery? What failure would you embrace? And what would you release, and where, in the end, would you return and call home? In this new day, no magic, wishing, or wondering is required, for such a chance is always available. To join in this partnership, to tend this flame, even when it breaks our heart, to keep showing up, to go with courage into this dawning day. Come, let us start this work together. Ashe and Amen.